Thank you very much. Very good evening to all of you. While you enjoy this fabulous meal, we will get cracking on this subject. It seems to me this is an extremely interesting topic in terms of securitization of the development agenda and how we can de-securitize it and somewhat suggest a blueprint. Far be it for me to say that this panel will definitively suggest an immutable blueprint, but we will suggest a way out, at least the way we perceive it. So if I can just request my co-panelists, you have all the CVs of my fellow panelists, so I'm not going to introduce each one of them, but we have a wonderful panelists in terms of just the geographical distribution, not to mention their area of expertise. One from DFID, and one from South Africa, one from Nigeria, and one from Afghanistan. So we do have and from Brazil, excuse me. So we have a wonderful panel. And if I can ask each one of them to make opening remarks on this important issue. We will begin by at least accepting that we will interpret development very broadly, and we shall also try to look at de-securitization as a way of moving the development issues from the security sphere to the political sphere, and then look at how local communities can be helped to create this blueprint. So that's what we're trying to do. I am looking for So if I can begin with Rachel Glennerster, Chief Economist with DFID. Opening remarks, maybe 3-4 minutes on the subject before we move on to the next stage, where I will request all of you to give examples of whatever has happened in your domain of expertise, in your experience, to move this issue forward. So Rachel, you have the floor first.
Great, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk on this important topic. I'm going to start by being a bit provocative and say that there's having a security angle on development, I think, is increasingly important. So we may argue and discuss about how you do, how you want to involve security forces, particularly in development. But if we try and separate out development from security, we're going to run into problems. In particular, let me elaborate. So at DFID, we've been thinking a lot about the projections of where the extreme poor are going to be. And what's really clear is that an increasing number of the extreme poor in the world are going to be in fragile and conflict-affected states. So you cannot separate out development reductions in poverty from worrying about security, because the security issues or lack of security undermine health, they close schools, conflict destroys livelihoods, it destroys the environment. So these two issues are very much related. It's also the case that it flows both ways, right? Because we know that one of the best ways to reduce conflict is actually to promote development. So, there's evidence, for example, that increasing the wages of young men, making it more viable to work in in places like agriculture, the higher the returns in agriculture, the less conflict there is, because young men have alternative occupations. So we need to think of security and development as very tied, which does not necessarily mean that, if you look at the question about, that security agencies should necessarily be the people who are trying to deliver development. So we need to have a security lens on development, in the sense that conflict causes poverty, and poverty causes conflict, and to understand those links is really important. That doesn't mean to say that we ought to then be running our development through our security agencies.
So thank you, Rachel. I think that's important because de-securitising development, therefore, and I agree with you, doesn't mean that you take the security dimension completely out of development. You're trying to manage the contradictions, the relationship as it emerges case to case. So, Anil, you're from South Africa. You're Deputy Director General in the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. I'd love to know what your views are, just opening remarks on the subject itself, keeping in mind the experience of South Africa.
Thank you. Well, I think before we start talking about de-securitizing development, let's look at the development agenda globally and what's happened to the development agenda, especially over the past 2 decades. And when you bring the security dimension in, I think you are actually speaking of the over-securitization of development. You cannot take out security totally from development. Because in Africa, when we try to create an enabling, prosperous environment, we say that there cannot be any development without security. There cannot be security without development. They are interrelated. And what we need to do in terms of looking at the development environment, we need to take ownership of it again. By that I say that you need to bring development back into the development agenda. And I think that's a very important point that we need to be mindful of, because what has happened to the developmental agenda in global debates is been moved to the margins, and the development agenda has been hijacked by various entities. And increasingly, you can't just speak of governments in terms of development cooperation. You have to look at the role of the multinationals, non-state players, which also brings in a security dimension. So I think there are manifold spheres that has entered the development space and taken away the real focus, because all developing countries under duress, has development at the center. We all want to lift our people out of poverty, underdevelopment, and equity, and development is the center of it. But what has happened to the development agenda? And securitization or over-securitization is one dimension of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anil. I like that expression as well, over-securitization of the development agenda, and to reclaim the development agenda. That's what you were talking about. Renato, if I can ask you, he's from Director of the International Intelligence Unit in Brazil. Renato, do you broadly agree with Rachel and Anil in terms of 2 things? One, you really can't take security completely out of the development agenda, Rachel's point, and Anil's point that the problem, therefore, is really over-securitization of the development agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Given that we are in India, yes and no. I would like to bring another dimension to the issue, which is the conflict between these 2 ideas. Security, as I understand here, we are talking about national security, international security. So usually it deals with broader decisions in cases that interest to us, for instance, the option for a given technology, trade sanctions, restrictions on trade partners, restrictions on trade flows. I could give you many examples. So they are broad decisions. Development, apart from big concepts like growth, inequality reduction, has to do with regional and local issues. So I think it's unavoidable that there will be a conflict between security decisions in a state, federal, national level, and development issues. So this is the point I would like to bring in 2 minutes.
Thank you, Renato. I think that point is well taken as well. Can I now turn to Tosin from Nigeria, your Chief Operating Officer of a realty firm. Tosin, from your experience of Nigeria, would you say that this is a fair way of describing the complex relationship between development and security that the 3 speakers have highlighted? Renato's response was more nuanced, I would say. He says yes and no. But the other 2 are fairly clear that there is, you cannot wish security away. when you look at development issues. But can you at least prevent over-securitization of the issue and deal with development on its own merits?
Thank you for the question, and it's an honor to be here. And as I told my esteemed co-panelist here, I come to you today as a student. This is an area for me that I continue to learn more about, having studied political science and economic development, but really, truly, I'm a woman in technology. So that's my day job, but I am constantly learning and constantly asking questions, which I think is something that could add to this discussion today, are the questions. And so for me, as a citizen of both Nigeria and the United States, I have seen securitization at play in many ways. As it relates to Nigeria, to answer your question, I do agree that we cannot talk about development, just like you said, without talking about security. We know that Boko Haram exists in Nigeria. I mean, that is factual. However, I guess I would also then be nuanced in my response and say that we, in some cases, may have over-securitized the issue. And why do I say that? There is the concept of securitized development, which calls into question whether or not if the state actors are actually in this to help development or to just protect their own state interests. And so in the case of Boko Haram, with the United States, we had China, France, we had a couple of states that offered to, intervene and support. But as we look at the results of those interventions, one has to ask the question of whether or not the real, the goal was achieved, or whether it was mostly done just to protect, to say, listen, we see an unstable situation and we must protect our own interests in that state. And therefore, as we give aid, we're not able to really trace where it's going. We don't know, I could tell you for a fact that our military is still, they don't have the right weaponry, they don't have the right resources. Where's the money going? And so these are the questions that we're asking. Is we understand that we need to develop, and we understand that we cannot separate security from development, but at the same time, how are we monitoring, how the actors involved in all this, how they are participating and moving forward the agenda to ensure that we are actually achieving the goal of development along the way. Hope I'm making sense.
Thank you, Tosin. So it's really a chicken and egg issue, as I see it. I mean, it's almost commonplace to suggest that without conditions of security, you cannot have development. You cannot possibly have development when you have conditions of war or conditions of insecurity. But the question that is being posed is, what level of security do you need in order for local communities to engage in developmental goals? We will take that issue later on, but I also want to now turn to, and this is most interesting, as you may be the last but certainly not the least, Urzala, because Afghanistan, we know, is a country that has emerged from conditions of insecurity to relative security, and it would be very, very interesting to hear from you what you think of this dynamic between development and security.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, everyone. So maybe I can start by saying that I think Afghanistan fits very well to be part of this discussion, because I see my country as a kind of a lab, an experimental lab for different development approaches. Over the last 18 years, if I look at it from more sort of critical thinking point of view, in Afghanistan, I think probably even including Iraq, there hasn't been any other country where we have seen over-securitization and over-actually militarization of development. And for that reason, I think it's important to sort of highlight that experience and discuss about it. So if I can go a level deeper than other panelists by saying that, so what are the, so there are different actors involved in development, from local communities to the state and what they have to sort of provide, to also international intervening forces. Afghanistan has been subject to an international intervention post the fall of the Taliban back in 2001. And in this context of using development as a kind of a tool for foreign policy, we have seen quite a dramatic change in different approaches towards development. For example, and it is interesting because it is different from one country to another, but being imposed or being applied or implemented over the same geography, the same people, same time in cases. And there are like all kind of examples, all kind of studies that highlights the challenges and issues about it. For example, the US is following more a kind of a Wilsonian approach to this, which is more about intervention for self-defense, for promoting or spreading democracy, spreading capitalism and collective security. And the collective security in the Wilsonian context is more about our security. We are in Afghanistan because we want to protect ourselves because of who was apparently in Afghanistan back in 2001. So what it does to the people at the local level is something that requires a full detail of, like looking at how it actually turned. In parts, it has been good because a country completely abandoned almost to a level that non-existent level during the Taliban time, got kind of alive to injected some level of aid and support and development to make alive again. But then this life is making us extremely aid dependent. This life is raising a lot of issues with the over-militarization of development, which I'm very happy, very, very happy to say that we have moved on from that because luckily the international community, our partners in the United States, also our partners in different European countries, immediately in a short period of time realized that this over-militarization of development is not a long-term solution. It was experimented and it didn't really work. So at least we are in a good place that I see from different circles. They are not going to repeat it, but we have to record it and we have to learn from it. Thanks.
So thank you very much for that, Urzala. So it is difficult to strike this delicate balance between development and security, obviously. But what I want to request my panelists, without any conclusion at this stage, is to give examples from their experience of, and these could be good or bad examples, it doesn't matter. Ideally, I would like examples which are a little bit extreme so that we can draw the necessary conclusions. So either examples where development has eventually won out, or examples where there has been, as Anil says, an over-securitization of development so that development goals have suffered. And this is not to point fingers at anybody or apportion blame. It is merely to draw the necessary lessons, because I think this is a balance that countries and governments and societies will need to strike. And as I think we were chatting before the session began, and Anil made this point that it's going to get more complicated in the future. It's not as if things are getting simpler. It doesn't matter whether it is Afghanistan, India, or even the developed West. Constantly, because I didn't want to go into this whole area of cyber crime and hate crime and violent extremist language. But even that actually poses very existential questions on how much control you can have over the internet and how much we can allow developmental consideration. So I think everything will involve a trade-off. So I'm going to begin with you, Rachel, if you can give us an example from your experience of how this complex dynamic between development and security has played out.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to give a positive example because I think we all need positive examples. There's lots of depression about things where countries have fallen into war and fallen into greater conflict. I've had the privilege of working with the country of Sierra Leone and working first as a researcher and then providing advice to them ever since the end of the civil war there in 2004. And I think it's a really interesting success story, and I think we don't talk enough about successes. So this was a country that had been absolutely riven by a desperate civil war for 10 years. And yet since that time, it has moved on. it has seen great benefits in terms of development, and has gone through 2 political transitions since 2004, democratic transitions between, of power changing hands between parties. Now, how did we move from a situation where, decisions and powers decided by gunpoint to one where power was decided by the ballot box? Well, I think, there are a couple of reasons for that. One, of course, was partly just that the population was so completely sick of war. But I think another part of that was, the international community coming in and supporting first in a military way with peacekeepers. There was an international UN peacekeepers while the institutions were being built and the first elections were being held. Then support in terms of development. But I think a critical thing which I'd like to hone in on is there was a move to do decentralization in Sierra Leone. So that no longer, it wasn't the case that the election decided all power, right? If you lost out in an election, you lost all power. No, you could retreat to your regional stronghold. And so even if you lost at the national level, you could still have power in your regional area. And I think that was really crucial to building support for the democratic transition. It was also, and maybe, to slightly preempt the final part of the session, it was also critical in getting more involvement of local populations because people knew their local councillor. They didn't know their MP, but they knew their local councillor. They knew how to get hold of him or her, and so they felt more involved and they could be more engaged in development at that local decentralized level. So it both provided a safety valve in that, different parties had somewhere to retreat, but it also engaged the population more effectively. And I think that was critical to that move from having decisions made at gunpoint to having decisions made through the ballot box.
Thank you very much, and that's a very interesting example. I was as I was listening to you, it struck me that you are talking. You didn't mention it explicitly. You're talking sequencing. That there is a military intervention to make sure at least there was absence of war. You then said building institutions, and then you said decentralization. To me, that sounds like a sequence. That if you have a conflict or a war-ridden zone, your first objective should be to make sure there is no war. I'm not saying absolute peace, just the absence of war, so that it allows a certain amount of conditions which are conducive. Then, of course, you need institutions and you need decentralization. So I kind of like that sequence, but we will pick it up towards the last part of the session, depending on what others say. So, Anil, a good example, bad example, whatever example, but keeping in mind the lesson that we can draw.
Well, I think South Africa is a good example of where you saw the nexus of security and development totally abused and misused. If you look at South Africa under the apartheid regime was hell-bent on securing its existence through the military and through all security apparatus. It denied development to the majority community, and you had development focused on the minority community. And you see the remnants of that today through this negative policy that was employed. Today you have a developed South Africa and an underdeveloped South Africa. So you have two worlds in one. Post-1994, you took out the security dimension from it and focused on development per se, irrespective of differences in communities, religion, sex, whatever, across the country. So I think you see here where security is used in a negative sense to keep communities down in order to remain in power. Once you remove that and you level the playing ground and you focus on development, you have a change in the country and you have the true potential of the country blossoming. And that's what you see in the new South Africa. But I just want to bring one other point into the discussion, listening to the inputs. We should not confuse securitization of development with the militarization of development. They're two different concepts, and we can't equate both into one. Thank you.
Thank you, Anil. And that's very interesting as well, because in terms of what happened in South Africa, my sense is there was also a transfer of political power, which becomes an important aspect of what local communities can do in terms of development. I also like your distinction between militarization of development and securitization of development. When you take the floor next, you might want to explain just a little bit to our audience. But Renato, can I turn to you now with some examples from Brazil, please?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'll try to give you two simple examples, more to the normal side, because I think that examples from Afghanistan, Iraq are very interesting, but they are countries in extreme situations. My country is unique, but I think it's also normal. We are a peaceful country, we are not in war. So I'll try to give another kind of examples, okay? The first one is the following. We are a federation, and not a perfect federation, but states have a certain autonomy. And everybody, states, for instance, need investment. And sometimes you have nowadays countries which have a lot of money and they offer this money under no conditions or for certain purposes, which the federal government doesn't agree or doesn't want to engage in a closer relationship with a specific country as relates investment. But the state wants. So in my country nowadays, we have this very interesting example that we have a few states which have signed contracts under the law, directly the state with the country for specific investments. And this created trouble at the federal level because the federal level said that this was against the foreign policy and the foreign security policy. So I think this is a different example, but brings you another perspective of the conflict. Second, very short example. We have a very porous border in the south. Part of our southern border is very porous, comprises three countries, Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. And this border, because it is porous, there is a lot of interaction among the three countries. There is a lot of trade. There are a lot of duty-frees competing with each other in each country. Every week one lowers the price, so there is a flow of tourists or people buying, doing price arbitrage, and they go to duty-free in country A to sell the goods in country C and so forth. Well, but also this border is considered by the federal government for its own reasons, I'm not going to discuss if they are right or not, as a kind of dangerous border. Then from time to time, the federal government imposes restrictions and tightens the border. Whenever the government does this, there is a lot of problem, a lot of trouble for the three areas, for the development of the three areas, because trade disappears, people start to have problems to cross the border, the duty-frees don't sell anymore, the flows of tourists decreases considerably. So there is an intervention from above on the local development. And what they claim, that's the interesting point, and here comes back to the conflict, what they claim is that they can manage the security issues in the border, what is not accepted at the federal level. So I think it's another different example. Thank you.
Thank you, Renato. It's indeed an interesting example because it talks of border security and how development of border areas, extremely important for countries like India as well, because there's a lot of disparity between the development in the hinterland and the border areas. Tosin, you gave an example of Boko Haram already. I am inclined to think that was a good example, but it was still an extreme example because Boko Haram, whatever you may say, did pose a threat to the state. And the threat was concrete, the threat was present and imminent. But if I can request you to give maybe another example from Nigeria, if possible, on this, which can explain better this complex dynamic between development and security.
So yes, definitely an extreme example. Terrorism always is extreme. But like I said, I can pedal back to the sort of more of the current issue that is top of mind for many Nigerians right now, which I discussed with the panel earlier, is around the issue of the Fulani herdsmen. And I think part of the prompt for this panel actually touched on climate change, if I recall. And so I'm just going to draw that in a little bit here, even though I know it's a broader conversation that can be had, globally speaking. But, you know, at the time of our independence, we were at about 50 million people in Nigeria. That was around 1960. Now in 2020, we are closer to 200 million in one country. And with the climate change issues that we all, I hope in this room, agree that it exists. To think that there was a time when there was a conversation about whether or not climate change was a real thing or not. So as a result of that, what we have found is that there has been lack of arable land for a number of the cattle ranchers. And they get a lot of their sustenance from ranching. And so there's no land for their cattle to feed on. Majority of their customers come from the southern part of Nigeria. And so historically, they've always grazed. They're nomadic people by nature, the Fulani. So they graze throughout Nigeria. But again, with the increase in population, the urbanization of the countrysides, and climate change, there has been more of that foot traffic now going to the south. And they're now beginning to encroach on the lands of farmers, right? So the cattle are eating the farm, and that is causing conflict, right? And rather than our leadership to see it as a climate change issue, let's try to figure out how to, you know, maybe there was a recommendation made at one point to create pastures, and let's see what we can do. And folks said, not in my backyard. This is a threat. They're coming from the north. That's where Boko Haram is. We're all threatened, and we need to defend ourselves. And so now what the narrative is in Nigeria is that the herdsmen that are coming to the south, they're not doing it because they are trying to feed their cattle and sustain themselves. They're doing it because they're coming to kidnap us. They're coming to kidnap us. They have weapons because they're Boko Haram. So we're not able to, in some instances, differentiate between the issues even of what's going on. And so you have the Boko Haram, they're in the north. These herdsmen, they're from the north. They must all be wanting the same thing. And so now that issue has become securitized. And so now you have, I mean, it's crazy, but you literally will have, in some cases, I remember reading a news article about a gunfire exchange between the herdsmen and some motorists that were on the road because they had to defend themselves. And so then the question then becomes, how do we, in a country that I would say our democracy is a struggling democracy, how do we then pivot or change the perspective in order to see this as a development issue, not a security issue, right? Which is the very essence of why we're here. And so that's an example of what's going on in Nigeria right now. And it is a big deal because the herdsmen continue to come in. They have nowhere else to go. They are armed because they feel like they need to defend themselves. And those of us in the South don't have the foresight to realize that we need to beseech our government, right, to give aid, to support them by planting pastures, for example, rather than sending military or police to fight them with guns. And that's a very simple example, but that's an example of something that's not so extreme that's happening currently.
Thank you, Tosin. I think that's an excellent example of what Anil refers to as over-securitization of a development issue. So thank you for that. That's an excellent example of that. So can I now turn to Urzala? You know, there is, I cannot remember, at least in my lifetime, so much of international attention and investment in one country, Afghanistan. There's just been so much by way of investment, by way of military assistance, and it is continuing, really. And we're talking trillions and trillions of dollars. So I'm going to ask you if you can think of an excellent example in which, you know, the Afghan people have benefited enormously, because that would then, you know, help us understand the nature of intervention that should be considered a model intervention, if you like. No intervention can be model, but still, if we can look for good examples in a country like Afghanistan, and good examples should abound, normally speaking, because of what happened post 9/11 and the kind of international attention that you've had in Afghanistan. So if you can help me look at one or two examples. Thank you.
Thank you. As we were considered as extreme cases, so usually from extreme cases there are extreme examples. But I tried my best here now to think about, but also in my experience focusing on my PhD research in development studies, to look into, you know, different processes and figure out really like what really worked and what didn't. And of course, one thing before even I start to give my example to sort of like flag here is that there is no such example that is completely good or completely bad. Although I have to say the over-militarization, and I would like to also give the militarization example, and I agree that there are differences between securitization, but what I was specifically meaning is over-militarization of development. So if I start with a maybe good example and then move to the not so good example. The good example, I think, is at least one project which is framed as the community-driven development programs of the World Bank. It is funded by the World Bank. It is a proposal that is processed through the World Bank, but is actually, I looked at it basically ethnographically in terms of who was involved in the design, how it was actually turned into a model. And I think despite some challenges and flaws within this program, I see it as the most interesting example drawing, in some cases, from the Gandhian notion of development and decentralization, which is Panchayati Raj, and also in some others, it is inspired by the Indonesian experience, which also makes it quite interesting, but it's more to create kind of local level or village level sort of governance system and do the distribution of resources. So this program called NSP, National Solidarity Program in Afghanistan, formerly, and now since the last couple of years, it is turned into a Citizens Charter program. Like I said, the program has its flaws and issues, but it has been the most positive and the most successful example in the country where development assistance did not make it anywhere out of the major cities historically, like let alone the war period. But even before war period, we didn't have, you know, schools, we didn't have clinics, we didn't have hospitals, we didn't have proper, you know, micro hydro powers or different sources of energy created at the local level. But thanks to this form of development assistance, we were able, and it is also working because the model brings in the local communities, the civil society, NGOs, and NGOs in Afghanistan has a very particular history in the war times, basically replacing the state in the service delivery role of the state. And those NGOs were also a part of this program by facilitating the process. And finally, you know, the funding partners and so forth. So the challenges aside, I see that as the most successful example from Afghanistan where development assistance and aid reached to the most remote areas, and they did not consider secure and unsecure. Actually, this program, by the end of it 2 years ago, reached like almost 99.9%, so maybe there is 0.01% that didn't reach. Now, the not so good example is the military that I have to, like I stated in my earlier comments, I hope I have time. So the not so good example is the provincial reconstruction teams under the ISAF, the International Security Forces that operated. So PRTs, or provincial reconstruction teams, mix the civilians working with the military together. So imagine someone with an armed, you know, like having the guns in his body and then delivering, you know, building schools, building hospitals, and delivering aid and development. That created a lot of issues from the very beginning within the communities, but also in the security context in the area, because NGOs or the humanitarian actors on the ground were facing threats because the Taliban or the other oppositions were not making a difference. Who is an NGO, who is a humanitarian actor, who is, you know, with a white flag or with a military flag or anything. So that has been something that even at the very village level where I conducted my research, I find that it was hugely problematic, because just to give you an example of the problematic. So from the first model, the village representation is fully voluntarily. Like the village council head and all council members are acting and operating in a voluntary basis. So the PRT comes to the same village, and they basically hire people against salaries. They don't call it a salary. It's $180 for transportation and, you know, coming and attending the meetings. But in a context where people have zero income, it doesn't matter how you label it as like a stipend or, you know, allowance or whatever. It is salary. The people told me this when I went to the village and says, you know, I took the CDC leadership, which is the Community Development Council leadership, because I have a job and I'm fine with the voluntary work. But I give the mullah sahib, you know, the mullah of the village, the role to attend this pro-military council because there is some salary involved. So they see it like that. And so imagine what kind of confusion it creates. It created actually within the villages, where after that, whenever aid workers or development workers or civil society activists were trying to mobilize the communities, they were all looking and saying, how much are you going to pay us? Or maybe there is a payment and you put it in your pocket and you don't give it to us. So these are the kind of examples or issues that it caused. I mean, put aside the actual mission from the very like macro level, where the idea was to use aid as foreign policy, to use aid as winning hearts and minds, because this was the demand of every Afghan to have schools and hospitals and everything in their villages. So they say, if we mix the military and aid, then maybe it will work, we will win their hearts. But it actually didn't win any hearts and minds. Thanks.
Thank you very much for those fascinating examples, which makes me think actually that this is one reason why one-size-fits-all development is one thing that we should guard against. Because without knowing the local conditions, and I'm in India, we are supposed to know Afghanistan reasonably well. I had no idea about the things that you are talking about. So I think that should serve as a good warning to people who are prescribing a development model, shall I say. I've been asked by the organizers to finish at 9:30. We are now 9:15, and I'd like to at least say give 10, 12 minutes for questions and answers. But before that, yes, I will certainly give an opportunity to ask questions. But as a moderator, I'll be failing in my duty if I did not attempt to summarize. It's not an easy task, but I shall try. I'll make 3 propositions and ask my fellow panelists to save time, maybe just say yes or no or modify it as you like. One is this distinction between militarization and securitization, and warning against over-securitizing this issue. That is very clear that is not something that is, you know, advisable. So that is point number 1. Point number 2 is a point of my own, but I'm happy to be corrected by my fellow panelists who know more about this than I do. You need to really have a dialogue with security agencies rather than demonize them. They have a role to play. We have agreed that you cannot remove security completely out of this development basket. So if that is the assumption, then you have to somehow conceive of a situation where they coexist. And if you have to do that in today's day and age, I don't see how you can do it without having a dialogue with the security agencies. In most of our countries, and I, again, like to be corrected by the panel, but in most of our countries, given today's age, post 9/11 and the rest of it, security agencies will have a kind of a veto, if you like. That's been my experience, but I'm glad to be corrected. So dialogue rather than demonizing. And finally, really from the examples that we have heard from fellow panelists, an inclusive process where you have a fair degree of decentralization for local communities seems like a sine qua non, really. Without that, I mean, I think I liked Rachel's sequencing as well. You know, you look at a situation, how are you going to bring development? Or even the situations, Tosin, you mentioned, which is, you first try to achieve not absolute peace, but at least absence of war. And I like that because in parallel, you don't wait. You don't wait to achieve absolute peace, which might take 100 years. In parallel, you need to set in motion a process of creating institutions, decentralizing, try to get some development so that people can see the fruits of development and then change their minds. So that is an important aspect as well. So those really are my tentative conclusions, dear panelists, and I wanted to ask if anybody had a serious problem with it. Renato, yeah. Please.
Strongly agree with number 3. Agree with number 1. And I think number 2 is second order, and I would replace greater social control instead of dialogue on the security.
I agree. I agree with that.
No problem at all.
Yes.
So we replace dialogue with social control. Societal control, anyway, everybody gets the drift. Anyway, those really are the broad conclusions that one can draw from this extremely wonderful panel that I've had the good fortune or the honor of chairing. So can I ask if there are questions? Maybe I should just start with the lady. Yes? And then you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. I work for the Security Council, where development is almost a taboo because some of the members want to focus exclusively on peace and security matters and want to leave development to other UN bodies or agencies. And I was wondering whether the effects of this decoupling between security and development in the Council are felt in the cases where there is UN peacekeeping through the mandates. And we talked about sequencing, but should it be built into the process from the start? Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody who wants to take that question, or maybe we will pick up some questions and then I'll ask the panelists. Yes, please. And there's somebody at the back as well, but first you go, yeah.
Actually, I have one comment. And
you could introduce yourself as well. I should have asked that of you, but anyway.
My name is Mamdouh. I'm from Egypt. Actually, I have one comment and one question. The first one was, I have a master's degree in international security. So we learned that securitization is like when a state attach certain issues to security issues which may not, in order to support their own interests. Actually, we can't separate development from security at all, because development has become a basic need for any nations in order to not only the military development, but for technological development, health development, economic development, which also all of them affect the security development, internal and non-international development levels. And as for the question regarding for unmilitary development for securitization, so I have a question. What is the solution for intrastate conflict when a third party intervene in order to settle the dispute and impose certain issues and sanctions upon one of the conflicting parties during the mediation process? Thank you.
So let me understand this question so that my panelists can answer. You are talking of third-party intervention with the permission of the parties concerned, the principal parties concerned, or against their wish?
No, it's acceptance with their consent.
So the parties to the conflict invite a third party to come in?
Yeah. It may be, there are two ways for intervening, like Security Council resolution or intervention by invitation. And each of them, maybe some of conflicting parties may act as a spoiler in the conflict, so he may doesn't respect the resolution or what third party intervention third party do in order to have the mediation process and settle the dispute.
Don't know if you understand the question. You do. Okay, Anil, I'll let you answer that. Any other question? Yeah, at the back. Somebody, yes, please.
Good evening. We've talked until now about how security can give the conditions to build the institutions, but I also wanted to point out that security organizations can also directly participate in institution building. For example, the EU or NATO that have programs that also help building in countries in their neighborhoods to strengthen good governance within the armed forces or the police forces, or train the police forces, the border, etc. So that was just one comment. And then a question that I had to the panelists is that towards the moderator concluded by saying we need more dialogue, and I thought that you mentioned, you understood in all the actors, whether the development actors or the security actors. And the panelists corrected you by saying, no, we need more social control. Could the panelists... thank you.
So, as I understand it, you want our colleague from Brazil to explain what he meant by social control. Yes? Okay. And Tosin, you agreed with him as well. So we'll give you that opportunity. But there was somebody else wanting to take the floor for a long time, and we deprived him there at the back.
Okay. So
yes, please. Go ahead. Sorry.
That's okay. My name is Rajat Sethi. I work with the Government of India. My question is with regards to the geopolitics of development. And increasingly what we are observing, at least with some countries which have reached an inflection point where they've managed poverty and development to some extent, start seeing with a lot of suspicion some of the development efforts which are being made by international organizations as well as some domestic grown organizations which come in with a very specific agenda. My question is that do you as folks who are working in various developmental organizations have started feeling that you've been used as pawns for advancing geopolitical interests in the regions, especially of rising or emerging powers? Thank you.
Very interesting question, but you'll force all of us to say emphatically no, but that's okay. We will, I am sure our panelists will give you a good response to that, but everybody understands where he's coming from. Any other question before I ask panelists? Yes, please.
So my name is Priscilla, I come from Kenya. I have had an opportunity to work with security companies, and one of the problems that we encounter as a country in Kenya is that sometimes development leads to conflict. So I can give an example of when one of the parts of Kenya we discovered oil, it led to a lot of conflict to the form where it started having the oil curse, because initially there was no conflict. So my question is, how do you control development in a way that does not lead to conflict that was not needed in the first place?
So this is about sharing the fruits of development in an equitable way among all the stakeholders, I'm thinking. So that's a question I will let the panelists answer as well. Any further questions before I turn for a final round to my fellow panelists? No? Okay, thank you. So Anil, if I can start with you and then we will go this way.
I will take 2 minutes and answer all of the questions. Firstly, nexus between development and peace and security within the Security Council. I started my presentation by saying this, that we have moved development out. Development is cross-cutting. You can't isolate it. Peace and security and development are interrelated. So we need to bring it back into the center. With regard to social conditions, and my colleagues will answer that, I think, more fully. The geopolitics of development, you can't take out geopolitics from development. It's not just in terms of North-South, even South-South cooperation today. And I want to very quickly allude to the example of IPSA, the IPSA fund. That's an excellent example of South-South cooperation. No securitization, no strings attached, and it's won 2 UN awards as a new model, and we should look at that. Development leads to conflict. Yes, that's the curse of oil resource in Africa, because we mismanage our resources and we don't get it to work for the upliftment of our people, for the upliftment of our country, and direct it where it should be directed. Naturally, you'll have conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Anil. Thank you, Anil. Rachel, any further additions, modifications?
Yeah, just on that last one of development leading to conflict, it's obviously incredibly tragic when we see it. And I'm a researcher, so I will before I came to DFID, there's some really interesting. I mentioned the example of how increasing wages in labor-intensive industry reduces conflict. There's the same evidence actually shows that when oil prices go up, in countries with resources, you actually see increases in conflict. So there's kind of a very direct relationship. And what the way to think about it is basically you want to, you know, if people are fighting over a single resource, it'll increase conflict. But understanding that improving the return to work versus a young man going into conflict is actually a really clear, there's a lot of clear evidence of that, and it gives you a route by which to think about when and how development leads to reductions in conflict, because it's not as simple as it always leads to reductions in conflict. I'm going to slightly change the rules and say I want to come back on one of the things you said about the community, you know, the program in Afghanistan that worked extremely well. And you said this is one size doesn't fit, a proof that one size doesn't fit all. But actually, there's remarkably similar evidence from many countries of exactly that point, which is that we can get money to communities, even in very difficult post-conflict situations, through the mechanism that was tried in Afghanistan. People have proved that in DRC. We looked at it in Sierra Leone. There's an example in Liberia. So getting money to communities in post-conflict situations it's really critical, and using communities get the money out is very effective. And I think it's really important when we do development in post-conflict situations that we provide resources in ways that build the institutions of the country rather than circumvent them. So militarization is one way in which to not do that, right? To have the military provide the money rather than the communities. It's not the only way we screw up. We should always be thinking when we go in a post-conflict, how do we provide support and aid in a way that builds that country's institutions rather than circumvents them?
Thank you, Rachel, for that very important clarification, actually. You're right. It's easy to say one size fits all, but I see where you're coming from. There are excellent lessons that can be learned and mistakes avoided. And I think resisting the temptation to reinvent the wheel every time, which, aid givers sometimes can do, is not very helpful. Renato, since you let the cat out among the pigeons by using a wonderful expression, social control, can you please explain?
Yes, of course. Greater social control. First of all, why? Because it is, in my view, that security agencies, they have a tendency to impose measures and impose behavior. And so, given this, oftentimes governments obey. They don't agree, they obey. So I think it's not a matter of dialogue. It's a matter of greater social control. Starting with a dialogue and continuing with the assessment of the will of the population. I give an example related to my first intervention. For instance, the choice of a top technology. The choice of a top technology, for instance, in telecommunications, is going to influence every region. So it is, of course, a state decision, but has to be discussed with society. Because society can have a view that goes against the federal government, and then society may want to take the risk of buying or using the other technology, which by certain reasons, some people in the federal government say, well, this can be dangerous, they can spy you. Well, society decides. So that's the point. And Mr. Chairman, if you allow me 30 seconds, this brings another variable which has not been mentioned here, and it's very important when we talk about development, is culture. That's why your summary point number 3 is so important. If you decentralize, you have more chance to be aware of the local culture. I give you a short, sadly ironic and funny example from my country. There was a huge program from the top to supply bathroom appliances to huge poor communities in the Northeast. Very costly, very good appliances, but the communities had hygienic habits completely different from the traditional ones. So it was a lot of money, and you would go to visit in the evaluation program the houses, you would find flower vases, you would find the appliances being used in most different things and never in a bathroom. So culture is very important, matters a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renato, for that example. Tosin, I saw you nodding quite vigorously to what Renato was saying.
Exactly.
So do I interpret that to mean that you are okay with societal control or social control? How do you interpret this societal control? I'm interested in that. Is it elections? Is it referendum?
Exactly. It's exactly as he stated. I think that coming from a country like Nigeria, you know, I have to say, I am a daughter of the soil completely. Love my country, but I also will tell you that dialogue is not something that has gotten us very far over the past couple of decades. I mean, when you talk about dialogue, you're talking, you're assuming you're talking to actors that are reasonable and that are trying to, you know, forward the agenda, you know, in a way that benefits the populace. And we cannot assume that in a state such as Nigeria. And so when we do talk about things not being one size fits all, that's an example of that, is to say, if you prescribe dialogue as one of the measures that we would enact in Nigeria, I will tell you that we won't get so far, because the actors, the government, they're not in it for the people, they're in it for themselves. And so the people have to continue to be brought into the conversation. And the only way to do that is, as we've touched on, which is why I said I agree with everything he said, is decentralization is part of this. It's part of what will help us to move the dialogue and to hold folks accountable, right? But if we just completely decide that we're going to give the power, you know, to the powers that be and allow them to then make this decision, we'll continue on the path that we're on, and it hasn't gotten us so far yet. And so that's why I agree with the form of social control.
Thank you very much. It's entirely appropriate that the last word should go to Urzala from Afghanistan. You got 1 minute to sum up, and then we will finish with this session.
Well, I thought you were summarizing with my colleagues, but yeah, just my overall sort of takeaway from this conversation is definitely that there is a clear link between development and security, so we cannot simply simplify or ignore that. But that link doesn't mean that development should go completely under the influence of the military. And I tend to also agree with both my panelist colleagues here about the issue of dialogue not being very functional with the security, because it's a one-way. Security institutions follow orders. They don't they are not open to dialogues, and they have their own reasonings for that, good or bad. That's a separate story. But then it's important to also make it clear, and that's why, like I said, I'm very happy that at least this model that didn't really work in Afghanistan did not influence our security forces. And since that is over, then the security forces within the country are more focused on the job, protecting the country and, you know, basically saving the communities. The international forces also have a very clear mandate of training and basically focusing on training our own military in military skills, not necessarily building schools and hospitals, which is someone else's job. So I will end it there by emphasizing again that this separation is necessary, but one has to be very careful with that. And I may also add one more thing regarding the decentralization. So we were having a pre-panel discussion about that. It's really crucial, and the best model in future is to really emphasize more on decentralization, but that has to be done in a very careful way, that it results to a balanced development, that all parts of countries and societies in deep poverty or in discrimination are receiving something, and there are, you know, inclusivity. That's why it's really critical in this decentralization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With that, we come to the end of this panel. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention and patience. Please join me in applauding this excellent panel.